They laughed when she bought a condemned Cold War bunker for $1. Then her husband's voice started playing from the walls. What she uncovered wasn't treasure. It was proof that her small Appalachian town was built on CIA money, Nazi gold, and murder. One mother against a machine that owned every sheriff, every church bell, every grave. But tonight, she's fighting back, with the whole world watching. When the mountain starts collapsing, only one question remains. Will the truth survive long enough to set anyone free? Winter rolled down from the ridge like an old debt collector, cold and relentless, seeping through the thin walls of Betty Jo Harlan's trailer. The furnace had coughed its last breath 2 nights ago, and now her breath came out in pale clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. The eviction notice on her door flapped with every gust, the red stamp reading, "Final Warning." She had exactly 3 crumpled dollars left and a boy to keep warm. Tucker slept curled under 2 quilts in the back room, his small frame barely visible. The boy never complained. He just watched her the way his father used to, quiet, worried, like he was already older than 7. Betty Jo sat at the kitchen table with her cracked phone glowing in the dark. She was scrolling through the county surplus auction site. Half out of habit, half out of hopelessness. Everything decent was already sold. Trucks, tools, even school desks. But then she saw it. Condemned structure, Blackthorn Ridge sector, starting bid, $1. She laughed under her breath. $1? Hell, I can lose that easy. The site glitched as she tapped bid now. The spinning wheel took forever. Somewhere outside, a loose piece of siding banged against the trailer like a heartbeat. Tucker stirred. The screen blinked. Congratulations, you are the winning bidder. Betty Jo stared at it for a long moment. She hadn't meant to win. She hadn't meant anything. But it felt like the universe had dared her to move. The next morning, she drove the battered F-150 through the fog that gathered low along Blackthorn's winding road. Kudzu swallowed telephone poles and fences. The radio played static, then a burst of gospel, then silence again. A one-eyed hound stood in the middle of the gravel road, unmoving as if guarding something. Betty Jo eased around it, muttering, "Don't you curse me, old soul." The GPS gave up a mile back. She followed the hand-painted sign that read, "Property of County, no trespassing," the kind of warning poor folks read as a challenge. The road ended at a field of frost and mud. In the center stood a concrete mound covered in vines. A rusted blast door leaned open like a broken jaw. Cold air spilled out of the dark. Tucker's father used to tell her about Cold War shelters buried in the hills. They built bunkers under everything, he'd said once. Even under lies. She stepped closer. The metal was ice against her palm. Her flashlight beam caught a faded stencil, PHX-01. The air smelled like dust and ozone. Inside, 13 spiral steps wound down into shadow. She counted them aloud, whispering numbers like prayers. The deeper she went, the thicker the hum beneath her boots. Steady, mechanical, alive. Her light flickered across peeling paint, a cot, a rusted locker, and finally a narrow hallway ending at a door marked maintenance closet. She pushed it open. A janitor's mop head hung stiff with age. A bucket turned to rust. But something was wrong with the wall behind it. Too smooth, too clean. Betty Jo tapped it, then pressed harder. The panel shifted. A hiss filled the air, and the wall slid back to reveal a tunnel glowing faint green from emergency lights still burning after decades. Her breath caught. The floor gleamed with condensation, and her footsteps echoed like whispers in a church. Lead-lined crates sat stacked in rows, their corners marked with fading stamps. Project Phoenix, 1963. She wiped the dust from one and pried it open with a crowbar she found on a shelf. Inside were gold bars wrapped in wax paper, U.S. Treasury bonds sealed in plastic, and reels of tape labeled with code names she could not read. Her hands trembled. It was enough money to buy 10 lives, maybe even buy one back. She heard herself laugh, sharp, breathless. "Tuck, baby, we ain't poor no more," she whispered to the air. Then she heard it. A slow, deliberate sound, metal sliding against metal. The unmistakable click of a shotgun being cocked. Betty Jo froze. The flashlight beam wobbled. Her eyes darted toward the tunnel entrance. From the shadows stepped a figure in a black shawl, silver hair catching the faint light. Her back was straight as a ruler, her eyes cold and alive. The voice was gravel dipped in honey. "Well," the old woman said, "took you long enough to find it." Betty Jo's stomach knotted. She knew that voice. Every soul in Blackthorn did. "Granny Maeve," she breathed. Maeve's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You must be the girl who bought my basement for $1." She lifted the shotgun slightly, the barrel glinting. "And I do believe you found something that never belonged to you." Betty Jo's heart slammed against her ribs. Her flashlight flickered, throwing long, trembling shadows across the crates marked Phoenix. "Who are you to say that?" Betty Jo asked, her voice shaking but standing tall anyway. Maeve's gaze hardened. "Child, I was born in this hollow, and I'll die in it. What sleeps down here feeds this town, keeps the lights on, the sheriff's badge polished, the pews full on Sunday. You think $1 buys you that?" The hum of the old generators deepened, like thunder crawling through bone. Betty Jo took a slow step back, her hand brushing the edge of a gold bar. The weight of it was shocking, dense, heavy, real. Maeve's finger flexed against the trigger. "Close that box, sweetheart, and walk out while you can." Betty Jo met her eyes. "And if I don't?" Maeve tilted her head. "Then the hollow eats you like it eats everything else that don't belong." For a long moment, neither moved, only the hum, the flicker, and the breath between them. Betty Jo's mind raced, not with fear, but with the same stubborn fire that had kept her alive this long. Her gaze flicked to a toolbox beside a generator, rusted but solid. She took one careful step, then another. Maeve's eyes followed, calm and knowing. "Don't be foolish now," the old woman said softly. Betty Jo nodded, as if agreeing, then grabbed the wrench, spun, and slammed it against the light fixture. Sparks showered the tunnel. In the flash of white, she lunged forward and swung the wrench at the shotgun. The blast went wild, echoing off the walls. Maeve stumbled back, cursing, the weapon clattering to the floor. Betty Jo didn't wait. She grabbed the ledger that had fallen from a nearby crate, its leather cover stamped with the same symbol, PHX. Then she ran, boots hammering the metal floor, breath ragged, the cold air slicing her lungs. Behind her, Maeve's voice rose through the dark like a hymn turned wrong. "You can't bury what was never dead, girl." Betty Jo climbed the 13 steps 2 at a time, burst through the blast door and into the gray daylight of Appalachia. The hills seemed to breathe with her, alive, watching. In the distance, the one-eyed hound stood on the road again, silent, waiting. Betty Jo pressed the ledger to her chest. Her hands shook, but her eyes were steady. Somewhere deep below, the hum of those impossible generators still pulsed, feeding the hollow like a heartbeat that refused to stop. And in that frozen breath between fear and fury, Betty Jo understood one thing clearly. Whatever she had found, whatever the hell Project Phoenix was, it was never meant to see the light. But now it had. The air inside the tunnel grew heavy with dust and smoke as the echo of the gunshot faded. Betty Jo stood with her back against the cold wall, chest heaving, clutching the worn leather ledger like it was her child. The faint hum of the generators had turned uneven, a mechanical heartbeat faltering in the dark. Behind her, Granny Maeve's voice floated through the smoke, steady, honeyed, and cruel. "Easy now, sweetheart," Maeve called. "No one has to get hurt. You are in over your head, and that ledger will not change that. You think you found salvation, but all you found is the reason this town still breathes." Betty Jo stepped back, gripping the crowbar tighter. The flashlight trembled in her other hand. Maeve limped forward into the faint light, her shawl darkened with dust, one hand steadying herself against the crates. The old woman's eyes gleamed like wet coal. "Here is the offer," Maeve said softly. "Take a crate, gold, bonds, whatever makes you feel rich enough to forget. You and that boy of yours disappear, raise him somewhere the mountains cannot find you, or stay here and let the hollow eat you both, like it ate the men who built this place." The words hung in the air like fog. For a moment, Betty Jo's knees almost buckled. The thought of Tucker sleeping under warm lights, eating from real plates, never knowing hunger again. It was enough to make her breath hitch. Maeve watched her closely. "You think the world's going to reward you for being noble? It does not. I have seen good people starve because they wanted to be right." Betty Jo's eyes burned. "My husband wanted to be right," she whispered, "and he ended up in a box on that hill because of you." Maeve's gaze flicked down. "Your husband dug where he was told not to. You do not dig in graves you cannot fill back." The words snapped something inside Betty Jo. She moved before thinking. In one swift motion, she grabbed a gold bar from the open crate and swung. The solid weight connected with Maeve's knee, and a crack echoed through the vault. Maeve screamed, the shotgun tumbling from her hands. Betty Jo did not wait for the echo to die. She snatched the ledger from the ground and ran toward the narrow corridor she came through. Behind her, Maeve's voice was no longer velvet. It was thunder. "You fool! You just lit the fuse!" A deep vibration shook the tunnel. The lights flickered red. Somewhere below, gears groaned and locks slammed shut. Betty Jo stumbled as the floor tilted. A recorded voice boomed from the intercom, old and tinny. "Containment breach detected. Seal all sections." "God, no," she whispered, sprinting up the corridor. Doors clanged shut behind her one by one, sealing the path in bursts of echoing metal. She reached the spiral stairs, boots slipping on the damp steel. Halfway up, the ceiling cracked, and a shower of concrete dust rained down, the air filled with the smell of ozone and burning wires. She climbed faster, lungs searing. When she reached the blast door, the pressure from below pushed it outward. It was jammed. She dropped the ledger and heaved against the wheel. It groaned but would not turn. From somewhere behind, a dull rumble grew louder. The charges were going off, one by one. The hollow was closing its own throat. Betty Jo slammed her shoulder against the wheel until it moved, inch by inch. The door finally gave way with a hiss, and she tumbled out into the freezing night. The mountains swallowed the sound of the explosion as the entrance collapsed behind her. She fell to her knees, coughing, watching dust rise into the moonlight. The field was empty, ghost pale with frost. In the distance, through the trees, she could see the faint glow of the town. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the ledger. She started walking. Every breath burned. The world tilted between silence and ringing. Her flashlight was gone. Only the moon guided her, pale and cold. The tree line gave way to a slope dotted with old stones. The cemetery. Betty Jo staggered through it, reading names she had grown up with, some she had buried herself. The wind carried the scent of pine and smoke. When she reached the center, she stopped. Her husband's grave sat beneath a crooked oak, the letters on his stone softened by rain. James Harlan, 1989 to 2023. Betty Jo fell to her knees. "You told me the truth once," she whispered. "You said they'd bury it deeper than anyone could find. Well, baby, I found it." The sound of tires crunching gravel broke the quiet. Headlights washed across the graves. A sheriff's cruiser idled at the edge of the hill, engine low and mean. Deputy Hollister stepped out, hand resting on his holster, eyes reflecting the blue lights. "Well, ain't this poetic," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "The widow and the dead man. You got something that don't belong to you, Miss Harlan." Betty Jo backed away, clutching the ledger tight against her chest. "You all work for her, don't you?" Hollister smiled without warmth. "Work for her? Honey, she is the ridge. We all just live on it." He drew his pistol. "Now hand it over before I forget you got a kid." The night shattered with the sound of gunfire as Betty Jo turned and ran. Bullets tore through the headstones, splintering stone and earth. She sprinted between graves, the ledger bouncing against her ribs. The cruiser's lights followed her, casting long, jagged shadows. A round tore through her jacket sleeve, burning her arm. She stumbled, but kept running, eyes fixed on the dark tree line ahead. The sound of the river grew louder, the Ocoee, swollen and fast from the thaw. She reached the edge of the embankment just as the cruiser's door slammed again. Hollister shouted, "Stop! Or I'll," but she was already gone. Betty Jo dove headfirst into the black water. The cold hit her like a fist, stealing her breath, dragging her under. She clamped her jaw around the ledger's spine, refusing to let go. The current grabbed her, spun her, tore her hat away, pulled her downstream into darkness. The river swallowed the gunfire. When Betty Jo woke, the world was gray and shivering. Her body lay tangled in river reeds, her hair stiff with frost. Dawn bled slowly over the hills, turning the mist gold. The ledger was still in her hands, soaked but intact. She rolled onto her side, coughing water and mud. In the distance through the fog, a small country church stood on the hillside. Its neon cross flickered, pink and white, buzzing faintly in the cold morning air. She dragged herself toward it, each step leaving a wet print in the dirt. Her clothes clung to her skin, her lungs wheezed, but she kept moving. The closer she got, the warmer the light seemed to grow, though it was only illusion. When she reached the steps, she collapsed against the railing. A figure opened the door, a tall man in a threadbare coat holding a lantern. His face was shadowed, but his voice was calm. Ma'am, you all right? Betty Jo looked up, mud streaking her face, eyes glassy and fierce. She pressed the ledger to her chest. I can't let them have it, she whispered. The man frowned. Who? The ones who own this town. Her voice cracked. The ones who built the hollow. The lantern light trembled across her face, catching the raw, stubborn fire in her eyes. Behind her, the first full rays of morning reached the ridgeline, washing the frost in gold. Betty Jo's lips moved in a breath that sounded like a vow. They took everything from us. I'm done running. The man looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once and opened the door wider. Then you'd better come inside. She stepped through the doorway into the dim glow of the church, leaving the river and the old world behind her. Outside, the neon cross flickered again. Steady now, burning through the mist like a promise. Smoke rose from the valley long before the sirens came. Thick and black, it curled above the tree line like a funeral flag, blotting out the morning sun. Betty Jo watched from the church window, a wet towel pressed to the cuts on her arm. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "That's my place." Reverend Silas didn't have to look twice. He had seen that smoke before. Afghanistan, Baghdad, even here in Blackthorn when the mine caught fire in '98. He laid a hand on her shoulder, steady and quiet. Then they're not just warning you, they're wiping you clean off the map. Down in the valley, what used to be Betty Jo's trailer was a smoldering skeleton. The old porch swing melted into the dirt. Her few tools, Tucker's bike, the photo of James in uniform, all of it turned to ash. On the ridge above, hidden among the sycamores, her cousin Dwayne held Tucker close. The boy didn't cry. He just stared, his father's dog tags clutched in his small hand, the reflection of fire dancing in his eyes. "They'll think we're dead, right?" Tucker whispered. Dwayne glanced down, the glow from his cigarette hiding the fear in his face. "That's what we want him to think, kid." The night before, Silas had carried Betty Jo across the church threshold, soaked and shaking from the river. Now she sat in his study, wrapped in a wool blanket, staring at the strange items laid out on his desk, 3 damp film reels, the cracked ledger, and a single gold bar the size of a paperback. "Where'd you find these again?" Silas asked, adjusting his glasses. "Under a mountain," Betty Jo said softly, "and under about 50 years of lies." Silas picked up one of the reels, squinting at the code scrawled along its edge, PHX 63 Delta / Operation Nightjar. "These ain't from any coal company." He turned the reel over, spotting a small engraving of numbers along the rim. His expression changed, recognition and dread all at once. "These are military catalog numbers, the kind used on classified supply shipments." He exhaled slowly. "Lord help us." At the same hour, a black SUV rolled into Blackthorn Elementary's gravel lot. The sun caught its tinted windows, blinding the kids playing foursquare near the steps. 2 men and a woman stepped out, all dressed in cheap gray suits. One flashed a fake ID with the CPS logo. "We're here for a wellness check," the man said. Tucker Harlan. Miss Loretta, the principal, was halfway through her morning coffee when she saw them. Her gut went cold. She recognized the woman's shoes first. Polished leather boots that didn't belong to anyone from state services. She had seen boots like that at the McCandless Christmas Gala, right next to Maeve's wheelchair. "You folks got paperwork?" Loretta asked. The man smiled. "Of course." He opened his folder. The pages were blank. Loretta's hand slid toward the office phone. "You can wait right here while I call the county." Before she could dial, one of the men reached across the counter and unplugged the phone line. The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Loretta looked him dead in the eye. "You just made the wrong move, son." 5 minutes later, every classroom door in Blackthorn Elementary was locked. Desks were shoved against windows. Loretta dragged a heavy filing cabinet across the office entrance while teachers herded children into corners. She set up her phone on a tripod, turned on Facebook Live, and aimed the camera at herself. Her voice was steady, like the Sunday announcements at church. "This is Miss Loretta Hayes at Blackthorn Elementary. 3 individuals posing as Child Protective Services are trying to take one of our students. We are safe for now, and we are not letting them in." The stream exploded. Within minutes, comments poured in from every corner of Appalachia. Parents, truckers, veterans, even old miners who hadn't been to town in years. "Stay strong, Miss Loretta. Call the sheriff. Don't trust Hollister." The fake agents paced outside, trapped between the rising noise and the camera pointed straight at them. For the first time in decades, Blackthorn's dirty secrets were lit up in public daylight. At the church, Silas threaded one of the reels through his old projector. "We need to know what we're sitting on before we move," he said. The film crackled to life, flickering against the far wall. The image was grainy. Military men at a conference table, voices low but clear. Betty Jo leaned closer as one of them spoke, his words sharp, practiced, and cold. "Phoenix assets recovered from Operation Valkyrie have been allocated for discretionary funding. Black operations, foreign and domestic. No paper trail, no oversight." Another voice replied, filtered through static. "Use intermediaries, establish shell fronts, small-town investments, coal, timber, education. Nobody looks twice at a mining town." Betty Jo's stomach turned. Silas paused the film, the light freezing across his face. "They were using stolen Nazi gold to fund Saya missions," he murmured, "and Blackthorn was one of their cover sites." Betty Jo pressed her palm to her forehead. "That means the whole town's built on blood money." "Built and bought," Silas said quietly, "and Maeve McCandless is the one holding the receipts." Betty Jo's mind raced. She saw the burning trailer, Tucker's empty room, the hollow closing around them like a mouth. Every path she took ended with another hand reaching to silence her. Silas leaned forward. "You could disappear. I've got friends up in Virginia, quiet place. You could raise your boy without looking over your shoulder." Betty Jo looked down at the ledger, the ink running from water damage but still legible, names, dates, transfers, all of it. "Hide," she whispered. "That's what they count on." "Betty." She stood, fire catching in her eyes. "My husband died trying to tell the truth, or they called him crazy. They buried him in a box with no flag. I'm not letting them do that to me, or to my boy." The Reverend's jaw tightened. "If you go loud, you won't just be fighting them. You'll be fighting the town too." "I know," she said, voice steady now, "but I'd rather die telling the truth than live pretending it ain't there." Outside, church bells began to ring, their sound warped by the cold wind. Up on the ridge, Dwayne's phone buzzed. The live stream from the school was still running, the view count in the thousands. He turned the screen toward Tucker. "Your mama's name's everywhere, kid. She's stirring the hornet's nest." Tucker looked at the smoke still rising from the valley, then back at the phone. "She's not afraid of hornets." Dwayne smiled faintly. "Yeah, guess she ain't." Back at the church. Betty Jo pulled her wet hair into a ponytail and slipped her arms into her husband's old jacket. The gold bar and the ledger went to a duffel bag. She tucked one of the reels into her coat pocket. Silas watched her from the doorway. "You sure about this?" She nodded. "They burned my home, tried to take my boy. The only thing left to lose is my silence." He sighed. "Then you'll need an audience." Betty Jo gave a small, grim smile. "Good thing the whole country's watching Blackthorn Elementary right now." She slung the bag over her shoulder and stepped into the gray afternoon. The wind smelled like rain and smoke, the taste of something ending and something else just beginning. As she walked down the road, the church's neon cross flickered behind her. One light going out, another sparking back to life. Betty Jo didn't look back. She was already planning her next move, every step carrying her closer to the truth that no one in Blackthorn wanted to see, and no one would be able to ignore. The machine had started to erase her. She would answer by making herself impossible to forget. The sky over Blackthorn Ridge was the color of wet iron when Betty Jo stepped out of the church basement carrying a duffel bag full of sins. The wind clawed through her hair, smelling of rain and pine and smoke. The world had already taken her home, her safety, and her quiet, but not her truth, not yet. She spread the contents of the duffel across the pew, microfilm rolls, pages from the ledger, and one gold bar she had carved into thin slivers with a hacksaw borrowed from Reverend Silas. Each sliver gleamed like proof the devil had an accountant. "Lord, forgive me if I'm wrong," she whispered, "but silence is a sin too." Silas stood by the doorway, arms folded, his face carved from shadow. "Once you send this out, there's no climbing back into the cave." Betty Jo zipped the bag, slung it over her shoulder, and met his eyes. "Then I'll burn the cave down." By dawn, she was at the county post office. The clerk, half asleep, half curious, watched as she lined up 20 packages on the counter. Each envelope was addressed in shaky handwriting. Knoxville Gazette, Chattanooga Times, FBI Field Office, Channel 8 Investigations, The Truth Underground Podcast. Every package had something inside that could upend the mountain. Microfilm reels labeled Project Phoenix 1963, photocopied ledger pages showing wire transfers from McCandless Mining to Shell Corporations, and a gold sliver taped inside as proof the treasure was real. When the clerk asked, "You movin' or startin' a war?" she smiled faintly, "Maybe both." The postmark machine clanged and hummed, stamping time onto the truth. By the time she left, the rain had started. Cold Appalachian rain that blurred the edges of everything. Betty Jo drove Silas's old Chevy down Main Street, past the feed store, the diner, and the mural of coal miners with halos someone had painted years ago. People stared as she passed, some with pity, some with fear. Blackthorn was waking up to a rumor that was about to become a reckoning. 3 hours later, in a windowless room beneath the McCandless estate, Granny Maeve watched the first wave hit. Her assistant handed her a tablet, the screen glowing with news alerts. Whistleblower claims Appalachian town sits on CIA gold cache. Project Phoenix, secret bunker tied to Cold War funds. Maeve's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "Fool girl really did it," she murmured. The assistant cleared his throat. "Should we?" Maeve waved him silent. "No panic. Not yet." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp and wet. "If she wants a story, we'll give her one." Within hours, new footage surfaced online, CCTV from a security camera mounted near Betty Jo's trailer. The grainy video showed a woman in a hooded coat pouring gasoline around the porch before the fire. The face was distorted, but the frame froze just long enough for people to believe. The caption read, "Local woman fakes attack, torches own home and insurance scam." The hashtags came next. Gold liar, #trailer queen, Blackthorn hoax. At the church, Silas held his breath as his phone vibrated nonstop. "They're turning it back on you," he said. "Maeve's people are everywhere. Newsrooms, cops, the county clerk. You're fighting a machine that owns the ink." Betty Jo stared at the flickering screen showing her own blurred face, turned villain overnight. Her pulse hammered, but her voice stayed low. "Then I'll change the paper they're writing on." A knock hit the church door like thunder. 3 hard raps. Silas's eyes widened. Deputy Hollister's voice echoed through the wood. "Open up, Reverend! We got a warrant for harboring a fugitive." Betty Jo froze. Silas pulled her toward the back hall. "This way. Crawl space behind the baptistry. Quick." They slipped through the narrow passage as the front door splintered. Hollister's flashlight cut across the pews, sweeping over hymnals and dust. "Reverend, come on out. I know you're in here." Under the floorboards, Betty Jo crawled through cobwebs and dirt, clutching the ledger tight. Silas followed, whispering, "Keep low, follow the pipes." The smell of soil and old paint filled her nose. Above them, boots scraped across the wooden floor. Hollister's drawl floated through the cracks. "You preach about truth, Silas. Let's see if you practice it." They reached the end of the crawl space, a trapdoor that opened behind the tool shed. Silas pushed it up, and the two of them emerged into the rain-soaked graveyard behind the church. Betty Jo sucked in the cold air, chest heaving. Silas looked at her, mud streaking his face. "You got anywhere left to run?" Betty Jo shook her head. "I ain't running. I'm broadcasting." That night, the internet exploded. Clips of the Project Phoenix microfilm played across YouTube channels, podcasts, and late-night news segments. A true crime creator with 5 million subscribers dropped a new episode titled "The Hollow That Hides Gold." Her voice trembled with excitement. If this footage is authentic, we're talking about the single largest undeclared cache of stolen assets in U.S. history, hidden right under the Appalachian foothills. Comment sections caught fire. "She's lying for fame." "No, she's a hero. Look at the numbers. Real accounts." "My uncle worked for McCandless Mining. He said something was buried there." Half the country called her a fraud. The other half called her a martyr. In Blackthorn, TV trucks lined the main road, satellite dishes spinning toward the clouds. The mayor issued a statement calling the story baseless conspiracy. Maeve donated $20,000 to the Church Restoration Fund, and every local news anchor called her a pillar of the community. Silas turned off the television. "They're trying to rewrite it faster than you can tell it." Betty Jo wiped rain from her hair. "Then I'll make it louder." Near midnight, her phone buzzed. Tucker's name lit up the cracked screen. She answered fast. "Hey, baby, are you okay?" There was a long pause. Static hummed on the line. Then Tucker's small voice, shaking and whispering, came through. "Mama, the men are back." Betty Jo's throat went dry. "Where are you, sweetheart?" "I'm at Dwayne's still, up near the ridge. They're outside." His breath quickened. "Mama, they smell like gasoline." Her heart stopped. She could hear the tremor in his voice, the same fear she'd heard the night his father's convoy never came home. "Listen to me," she said softly, fighting the panic clawing up her throat. "Get Dwayne's old shotgun, the one behind the stove. Take it and get out the back through the trees. Stay low, keep your head down, and don't stop running till you see the creek. You hear me?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm coming for you." The call ended. Betty Jo stood in the churchyard under the trembling light of the neon cross, rain dripping from her hair, her breath coming fast and shallow. Behind her, Silas stepped out with a flashlight. "What happened?" She looked at him, eyes blazing with terror and fury. "They're going after my boy." The wind carried the smell of smoke again. This time faint, glinting, distant, familiar. Silas gripped her arm. Then it started. Betty Jo looked toward the dark ridge where her son was hiding. Lightning flared over the mountains, splitting the night like a warning. "No," she said quietly. "It ain't started yet." She lifted the ledger from her coat, the pages rippling in the storm, and whispered to herself like a prayer and a promise all at once. "They wanted a war." She turned toward the road. "Now they've got one." The McCandless mansion glowed like a lighthouse on the hill that night, every window golden, every laugh sharp as glass. Cars lined the drive, black and polished, dripping with rain under the string lights that swung gently in the wind. The annual charity gala was in full bloom. Sequins, bourbon, bone china, and the scent of old money pretending to be benevolence. Inside, the ballroom hummed with small-town royalty. County officials in starched collars, bankers in coal airs, their wives in pearls and practiced smiles. At the head table sat Granny Maeve, draped in silver silk, her legs still bound in a brace from the hit she took weeks earlier. Her voice carried over the string quartet. "To Blackthorn," she toasted, "and to the fine people who keep her heart beating." The crowd raised their glasses, but outside, under the dripping eaves, Betty Jo Harlan was already watching through the rain. She wore a borrowed Sunday dress that didn't quite fit, thanks to the hem dark with mud. Her hair was pulled back tight, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion and fire. In her backpack was an old projector, a roll of ledger scans, and a makeshift screen, an old white bedsheet. Reverend Silas's idea and her only weapon that didn't need bullets. She walked in through the front doors as if she belonged there, shoulders squared, heart hammering. No one stopped her at first. They just stared, some recognizing her from the viral news clips, others unsure why a woman from a burned trailer was standing beneath a chandelier worth more than her life. A waiter moved to block her path. Betty Jo lifted the projector high in one hand and shouted, "Everybody listen up." The music faltered. Conversation stuttered. Dozens of faces turned toward her. She stepped into the center of the room, rain still dripping from her coat onto the marble floor. "You've all heard the rumors," she said, voice shaking but growing stronger. "You've seen the lies they spread about me, about what I found in those tunnels. Well, tonight, you're going to see the truth with your own eyes." Maeve's champagne glass froze midair. "What is this nonsense?" she hissed. Betty Jo ignored her. She unfurled the bedsheet and taped it to the far wall between two portraits of the McCandless ancestors. The projector hummed to life, light cutting through the dim ballroom. The first image flickered onto the sheet. A scanned ledger page marked Project Phoenix, distribution of recovered assets 1963 to 1988, names, numbers, bank accounts, and at the top, a signature, Maeve McCandless. The room went still. Someone whispered, "Jesus, is that real?" Betty Jo pointed toward the list. "You see those account numbers? They match deposits made through the county's coal reclamation fund. For decades, y'all thought you were rebuilding Blackthorn. Turns out you were laundering war gold through it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few faces paled. A councilman's hand trembled on his glass. Maeve stood slowly, her voice smooth as velvet. "Miss Harlan, you have no idea what you're talking about. These papers are forgeries. This woman broke into my property, assaulted me, and..." Another slide appeared before she could finish. A typed memo stamped CA confidential, listing McCandless Mining Company as a logistical partner. The murmurs grew louder. Some people stepped back from Maeve's table. Betty Jo's voice cracked, but did not break. You buried my husband for finding this. You burned my home for keeping quiet. You sent men after my son. Maeve's hand slammed against the table. Enough. But the projector kept rolling. Scans of microfilm, photographs of crates stamped with Project Phoenix, and even a blurred image of the vault itself. Each flicker on the bedsheet felt like another nail in a coffin, only this time it was Maeve's. In the back of the room, someone whispered a name from the ledger, a local bank president. Another guest shouted, "You stole from all of us!" The room fractured. Voices rose, anger blooming like wildfire. "My daddy died in that mine!" A man shouted, "You said it was an accident." Maeve's security moved in. Deputy Hollister stormed through the side door, rifle slung across his chest, face tight with panic. "Everyone, calm down. This woman is under arrest." Betty Jo didn't move. "For what? Showing you the truth?" Hollister racked his rifle, the metallic sound slicing through the noise. "Get down, Harlan." The crowd backed away, but one figure stepped forward, a bent old man with coal-black hands and lungs full of dust. His name was Elijah Boone, a miner who had worked 40 years under McCandless Mountain. He stood between Hollister and Betty Jo, trembling but unyielding. "You want her," Elijah said, voice raspy but clear. "You go through us first." For a moment, time hung still. Hollister's eyes darted around the room. Behind Elijah, more miners rose. One, then another, then a dozen more. Old men with tired faces, young ones with grease on their jeans. Then the teachers, the bartenders, the grocery clerks. People who had lived their whole lives under the shadow of the McCandless name. Cell phones came up one by one, camera lights flaring like torches. The entire room glowed in digital firelight. "Put the gun down," someone shouted. Hollister hesitated, finger trembling on the trigger. Maeve's voice sliced through the chaos. "Do your job, deputy." But Hollister's hand shook harder. The sea of phones, the lenses, the judgment, they all stared back at him. Sir, Elijah took one slow step forward. "You shoot one of us. The whole country will see it live." Outside, thunder rolled over the ridge. The chandelier swayed, scattering shards of light across the crowd. Betty Jo stood in the middle of it all, the projector still humming behind her, the bedsheet trembling in the wind from an open window. Maeve's face twisted, her mask cracking. "You think these people will protect you?" She spat. "They'll turn on you the second you walk out that door. They always do." Betty Jo looked at the faces around her, neighbors, strangers, skeptics, and said softly, "Maybe, but tonight they're seeing what's real." The police sirens came next, distant at first, then closer, red and blue lights washing through the ballroom windows. The crowd parted as the sheriff's cars pulled up the drive, but before they could step inside, a teacher ran in from the rain, breathless and pale. "Betty Jo!" "Your boy, Tucker. He never made it home." The words hit like a bullet. Betty Jo's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "His ride from Dwayne's place, it never showed. We found his backpack in the parking lot by the gas station." Her stomach turned to ice. The sound of the rain faded, replaced by the faint hum of the projector and the echo of her own heartbeat. Maeve's lips curled in a cold, knowing smile. "You should have taken my offer, child." Betty Jo lunged, but Elijah caught her arm, holding her back. "Don't. That's what she wants." She tore herself free, breath ragged. "They have my son." The storm outside grew heavier, wind slamming against the old windows until the curtains snapped like flags. The bedsheet screen flapped violently, the projected light twisting and breaking across the room, but one image lingered before it faded, the signature of Maeve McCandless glowing against the white fabric. Betty Jo stared at it through the tears blurring her eyes. She had lit the fire, and now the whole town was burning with it. She whispered, almost to herself, "Hold on, baby. Mama's coming." And as thunder cracked over the ridge, the crowd parted for her once more. Not to stop her this time, but to let her go, because now everyone in Blackthorn knew what she was fighting for, and for the first time they believed she just might win. The fog rolled down the ridge like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the treetops and wrapping Blackthorn in a hush that felt older than prayer. The town hadn't slept since the gala. Reporters crowded the main road, miners guarded the church, and every front porch light burned through the night like a vigil. But Betty Jo was gone, vanished into the woods before dawn, chasing the only sound that still mattered. It started with a radio call. Silas was tuning through static on his battered ham set when a faint, broken voice came through, trembling with wind and fear. "Mama? It's me." Betty Jo's heart slammed against her ribs. "Tucker? Can't talk long," the boy whispered. "They said if I do, they'll hear it. I'm in a deer stand somewhere near the old quarry. I can hear Daddy's voice on a tape." The radio crackled, distorted by distance, but she could make out the faint sound behind him, a man's recorded voice saying something about honor and mission complete. Her throat went dry. It was James, her dead husband's voice, somehow alive in the hollow. Then another voice cut through the static, cold, controlled, unmistakable. "Mrs. Harlan," Maeve McCandless said, "let's not make this harder than it has to be. You want your boy back? Come alone. Bring the ledger. No cameras. No friends. No tricks. You have until nightfall." The transmission went dead. Silas looked at her, pale beneath the flickering fluorescent light. "If you go alone, she'll kill you. If you bring anyone, she'll kill him." Betty Jo leaned against the table, staring at the silent radio, the metal casing dented and old. "Then we'll give her both choices," she said quietly, "and make her choke on them." By afternoon, the whole town was moving like an army. Miss Loretta turned the school into a command post. Parents sat at desks with road maps and police scanners, passing coffee cups and phone chargers down the rows. Loretta pointed at the map spread across the chalkboard. "She's got to use one of 3 roads to get to the hollow. Boone's Cut, the Ridgeback Switchbacks, or the Service Trail. We station lookouts at all 3. Anyone spots movement, you radio me." Dwayne adjusted the strap of his shotgun. "And what if she changes the trail again? That hollow's got a dozen mouths." Silas was crouched in the corner, soldering wires to a GPS tracker no bigger than a matchbox. "Then we make sure Betty Jo's got an extra set of eyes." He sealed the device into the hem of her jacket. Another went into the spine of the ledger itself, hidden behind the leather binding. "You sure this'll work?" she asked. "No," Silas said. "But if God's listening, maybe he'll borrow a signal." Betty Jo smiled faintly. "He better have good reception down there." By dusk, the mountains glowed a bruised purple. The air smelled of wet pine and gasoline. Betty Jo parked her truck at the old rail bridge, exactly where Maeve's men said to meet. A single headlight blinked in the distance, a signal. She climbed out, clutching the ledger under her arm, her breath fogged in the cold. When she stepped into the clearing, 2 men in dark coats emerged from the shadows. One held a blindfold. "Put it on," the taller one said. "No talking." Betty Jo nodded. The fabric was damp, smelling faintly of oil and tobacco. They led her down a winding path, boots crunching on gravel, then onto metal grates. The air grew colder with every step. She could hear machinery thrumming deep below, the sound of the mountain breathing. When the ground leveled, they stopped. The blindfold came off. She stood at the entrance of another vault door, smaller than the first, but marked with the same symbol, PHX. A single lamp flickered above it, casting long, trembling shadows. Maeve sat in a wheelchair at the far end of the chamber, wrapped in her silver shawl, her face lit by the glow of an old film projector. On the screen behind her, Betty Jo saw grainy footage, soldiers shaking hands, crates being sealed, gold bars loaded onto trucks, and among them, James Harlan. Maeve smiled like a ghost. "He was one of us once, you know, until he got sentimental." Betty Jo's stomach twisted. "You made him disappear." "I kept him quiet," Maeve said softly. "The world runs on silence, dear. You, of all people, should have learned that by now." The boy's voice echoed faintly from a nearby speaker. Recorded. Desperate. "Mama, they said you'd come." Betty Jo's knees nearly buckled. "Where is he?" Maeve nodded toward the dark tunnel behind her. "Safe. For now." She gestured at the ledger. "You brought my property?" Betty Jo held it out, stepping closer. "I did. But we need to talk about what comes next." Maeve chuckled. "You're not negotiating, child. You're begging." "I don't beg," Betty Jo said. "I bargain." Up on the ridge, Silas crouched beside the antenna rig he'd built from scrap metal and prayer. "Signal's weak," he muttered, "but she's still moving." Loretta's voice came through the radio. "We've got eyes on Hollister's truck heading west. He's not going to the station." "Then he's going to her," Silas said. "Tell the parents to block Boone's Cut. No one in or out." Loretta's voice hardened. "You really think the sheriff's department is going to help us?" "I'm counting on them not to." He looked back at the valley below. Hundreds of porch lights glowing like embers, families standing guard on the roads. For once, Blackthorn wasn't looking away. Inside the vault, the air grew thick and hot. Maeve's men moved closer, rifles slung but ready. Betty Jo glanced at the wall and noticed something strange. A narrow vent covered with a polished steel plate, almost like a mirror. Her reflection flickered in it, warped by the curve of the metal. But behind that reflection, she caught the faintest glint of glass. A lens. The vault was watching. Her pulse kicked up. Every word, every move was being recorded. The truth wasn't buried here. It was being archived. She took a deep breath and met Maeve's gaze. "You're not saving your legacy, Maeve. You're preserving your confession." Maeve's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" Betty Jo nodded toward the vent. "Smile for the camera." Maeve's calm cracked for the first time. She turned toward her men. "Cut the feed." But before they could move, a low rumble shook the chamber, distant, rhythmic, almost like thunder. Betty Jo recognized the sound instantly. It was the miners striking the mountainside in unison with sledgehammers. Silas's signal. The distraction bought her one breath, maybe two. She dropped the ledger at Maeve's feet and lunged for the vent, slamming her fist into the plate. It dented inward with a clang. The men shouted. Maeve screamed. The vent burst open, spilling dust and cables. Betty Jo saw the camera inside, a sleek modern lens wired into the wall. She ripped the cords free, sparks flying. The screen behind Maeve flickered wildly, shifting from the gold crates to live footage of the room itself. Her, Maeve, the guards, everything. Outside, miles away, Silas's monitor lit up with the same feed. "Good girl," he whispered. Maeve's voice rose above the chaos, raw and furious. "You think this changes anything? You think they'll believe you?" Betty Jo turned to her, breathing hard, blood on her knuckles. "I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to see." Maeve stared at her with something like grief. An old woman watching her empire crumble under fluorescent light. "You don't understand, child," she said softly. "The hollow always takes a heir. It needs one, and after tonight, it won't be me." Her hand slipped beneath her shawl. A click echoed. The guards froze, but before anyone could move, the lights went out. The mountain exhaled a long, deep breath that rattled the steel walls. Somewhere behind the noise, Betty Jo thought she heard her husband's voice again. Faint, recorded, but warm this time. "Get him out, Joe. Don't stop." Then in the dark came the soft sound of a boy calling for his mother, and she ran toward it. The vault's glow was the color of molten gold. Too beautiful, too wrong. It painted every crack in the walls, every trembling hand, every ghost that had built this place. Betty Jo stood motionless beneath the humming lights, breath shallow, as Maeve McCandless turned her wheelchair toward her with a slow, deliberate pivot. The old woman's face was slick with sweat, her eyes sharp and merciless. "You want to know the truth so badly?" Maeve said, voice echoing in the steel chamber. "Then choke on it, child." She gestured to one of the guards who slid an old film reel into the projector. The machine whirred, spitting dust into the air. A man's voice filled the vault, familiar, deep, soft-edged. Betty Jo's knees weakened. It was James. McCandless Mining, secondary site, requesting extraction confirmation. They said Phoenix was dismantled in '63, but it's still here. It never stopped. The recording cut out with a sharp click. Betty Jo's mouth went dry. "Where did you get that?" Maeve smiled like a wolf. "From the same people who brought him home in a box. You think he died a hero overseas?" "No, my dear. He died right here in Tennessee in 2013. He found this place before you ever did." And when he tried to tell the world, they made sure he didn't finish the story. The hum of the generators filled the silence. Betty Jo's fingers went numb. "You're lying." Maeve leaned forward, the silver shawl sliding off her shoulders. "I told him the same thing I told you. Leave it buried. Raise your boy." But he couldn't let it go, so we melted him down with the rest of the gold he wanted to save. Maeve reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small object, a pair of dog tags. The metal glimmered under the vault light. "Recognize these?" Betty Jo staggered back as if struck. "Those are his. Alloyed from a bar in the vault." Maeve interrupted. "A family joke. A little souvenir for the widow. You've been wearing our secret around your boy's neck all these years." A sound broke from the shadows near the tunnel, a small, strangled cry. Tucker. He had been there all along, just out of sight, a guard's hand on his shoulder. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears. The dog tags hung around his neck, trembling as he breathed. He stared at Maeve, then at his mother. "Mama," he whispered, voice shaking, back. "Is it true?" Betty Jo's heart split open. She wanted to tell him no, to lie, to give him one last piece of childhood before the world devoured it. But she couldn't. Her voice cracked. I don't know, baby. I don't know anymore. Tucker looked down at the tags, his father's name glinting faintly. Then he let out a sound that didn't belong in a child's throat, a broken animal noise that filled the vault and made even the guards flinch. Boys don't cry like that twice in a lifetime. Maeve watched, expression unreadable. Now you understand, she said softly. The hollow doesn't take without giving. Your husband gave his silence, and you'll give yours, or your boy will join him. Something inside Betty Jo went very still. The grief didn't knock her down. It calcified. Her shaking stopped, her breathing slowed. When she looked up again, her eyes were dry and sharp as cut glass. You shouldn't have told me that, she said quietly. Maeve blinked. And why's that? Because now I know exactly what you fear losing. She glanced around the vault, her gaze sweeping across the cables that snaked along the floor. The conduit boxes marked fail-safe system, ventilation/power control. The mechanic in her saw what the mother couldn't, the pattern of it, the weak joints, the rhythm of the machine's breathing. On the far wall hung a steel clipboard covered in diagrams, half-faded blueprints from the 1960s. She caught the words fail-safe charges, pressure release sequence A, B. Her mind started turning, fast and mechanical. Every hum, every flicker, every inch of wire was a path she could follow. The hollow wasn't just a tomb. It was a circuit, and circuits could be broken. While Maeve droned on about legacy and balance, Betty Jo took one silent step back, memorizing the map with a glance. Power conduits led into the far ventilation shafts, rigged to charges that could seal the tunnels. If she reversed the polarity, just like she'd done on carburetors her whole life, it might do the opposite. Blow the vents open. Freedom from the inside out. Maeve's voice sharpened. You're thinking of fighting me, but you can't fight what you are. The hollow owns your blood now, same as it owned his. Betty Jo smiled, but it wasn't kindness. Then it's about time it met the wrong kind of air. She turned to Tucker, eyes fierce. You listen to me, baby. You hold on. I'm going to get you out of here. You understand? Tucker nodded, jaw trembling, but there was fire behind the tears now. He looked like James, defiant even when cornered. Maeve wheeled herself closer, suspicion creeping into her face. What are you planning? Betty Jo met her gaze, voice calm and deadly. Finishing what my husband started. Maeve's expression darkened. You won't make it out alive. Maybe not, Betty Jo said, her voice low. But neither will your secret. She reached down, picked up the clipboard, and slipped it into her coat. One of the guards stepped forward, raising his rifle, but Maeve lifted her hand. Let her go, she said. Let her see what happens when she tries to fight the mountain. As Betty Jo turned toward the tunnel, she felt Tucker's small fingers brush her sleeve. Mama? She looked down, her voice barely more than a whisper. Your daddy tried to save the truth. I'm going to make sure it lives. The vault lights flickered again, buzzing like hornets. Somewhere deep in the walls, the machinery groaned, a reminder that the hollow was still alive, still watching, still waiting. Betty Jo didn't look back as she stepped into the shadows, her husband's ghost echoing behind her and the plan already forming in her mind. Wires, switches, circuits, freedom. Pain had become her compass, and for the first time she knew exactly where it was pointing. The tunnels of Blackthorn breathed like a living thing. Each hum of machinery carried through the walls like the steady pulse of a creature dreaming beneath the earth. Betty Jo knelt beside a control panel half buried in dust, her flashlight trembling across gauges marked in faded stencils, failsafe A, failsafe B, ventilation pressure control. She brushed the grime away with her sleeve, revealing wires that glowed faintly blue in the dim light. Her fingers shook, but her mind was sharp. Years of fixing trucks and rewiring old farm generators had trained her hands to see patterns. The hollow wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a machine, and she could break it. Tucker crouched beside her, his face streaked with soot. Mama, what are you doing? She smiled, the kind that was too tired to reach her eyes, turning the devil's teeth against him. Back in town, Reverend Silas sat hunched over the ham radio, his eyes on the clock. The church was dark except for the red glow of the transmitter light. Dwayne's voice crackled through the static. You sure about this, preacher? The propane tanks are ready, but it's going to make one hell of a mess. That's the idea, Silas replied. Soon as you hear the hymn, you light it. That'll draw Hollister and his boys off the ridge. Betty Jo gets her window. Silas leaned back, wiped sweat from his brow, and whispered a prayer under his breath. Then he reached for the microphone, his voice low and steady. This one's for her. He pressed the button and began to sing, soft at first, then stronger. A hymn every Appalachian child knew, Shall We Gather at the River. The sound drifted out over the AM frequency, carried through static and storm. Deep in the hollow, Betty Jo heard it echo faintly through the vents, her eyes filled with tears. That's our cue, she whispered. She worked fast, cutting and rewiring the detonator circuits. The hollow's designers had built the system to collapse the tunnels in a precise sequence, sealing everything: gold, records, bodies, forever. Betty Jo's plan was to flip it, to choke off only the entrances and vents while keeping the main chamber intact. Her flashlight beam caught a small detail stamped on the conduit, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 1963. Even the lies here had a government label. She pulled the final fuse, crossed the lines, and twisted them tight. Sparks leapt from the panel, lighting her face in ghostly blue. Done, she murmured. When that signal hits, the hollow's gonna eat itself. A distant boom shook the ground. Dwayne's explosion, right on time. The entire chamber rattled, dust raining down like gray snow. Maeve, watching from her control chair on the opposite side of the vault, looked up in confusion. What was that? Her assistant checked the monitor feeds. Propane tank, topside near the ridge. Maeve's eyes narrowed. No, that's a diversion. She's moving. Betty Jo grabbed Tucker's hand. We've got to go, baby. Stay close. They ran through the narrow passageways as alarms screamed. The hum of machinery turned to the roar of failing engines. She could feel the air pressure change, the hollow itself gasping as the vents began to collapse. Behind them, Maeve's voice echoed through the intercom, shrill and furious. Seal the exits. Lock the chamber. Betty Jo didn't stop. She shoved open a maintenance hatch and climbed into a shaft lined with old pipes and cables. The air grew hotter the higher they climbed. Metal groaned, the whole mountain shuddering as the failsafe sequence triggered in reverse. Suddenly, a blast wave tore through the corridor behind them. The force threw Tucker forward, knocking his flashlight from his hand. It clattered down into the dark below. Mama, he cried, I'm here. Betty Jo pulled him close, her arms trembling as they crawled upward toward a faint sliver of light. Keep climbing. They reached a cross-section where a vent grate hung half open. Through it, Betty Jo saw a flash of movement, one of Maeve's guards. A young man barely older than 20, blood trickling down his temple. His last name tag read Vaughn. He raised his rifle, then hesitated when he saw the boy. His voice cracked. She said you'd kill us all. Betty Jo stared back, panting. Look around you, son. She already did. For a long moment, the guard's hands shook. Then he lowered the gun. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pair of dog tags, and pressed them through the grate. These ain't hers, he said quietly. They're your husband's, the real ones. I found them in storage. Betty Jo froze. The tags were dented, scarred, but the metal was wrong, rougher, older, real. She closed her fingers around them, her chest breaking open with something between grief and rage. Thank you, she whispered. The young man nodded once. Go. She didn't hesitate. Betty Jo pushed Tucker through the vent, following close behind as the tunnel behind them collapsed in thunder and dust. In the main vault, Maeve's monitors flickered. The live feed from her hidden cameras began streaming not to her private servers, but to the outside world. Dozens of screens across town, phones, tablets, televisions, lit up with her image. There she was, sitting in her silver shawl amid the chaos, barking orders as the mountain crumbled. Her own cameras had betrayed her. Cut the signal, she screamed. Cut it now. But no one moved. The control room was empty. Her empire, like the hollow itself, was devouring its own heart. Betty Jo and Tucker crawled through the final shaft. The light ahead grew brighter, the air cleaner. Each breath burned her lungs with dust, but she could feel wind again, real wind. Behind them, the mountain groaned like a wounded animal. The last of the failsafe charges detonated, sealing the lower tunnels. The shockwave sent a plume of dust and rock up through the exit vent, coating them in a fine gray powder. Tucker coughed, blinking through the haze. Mama? Are we out? Betty Jo looked at the horizon, the first trace of dawn breaking over the ridge. Yeah, baby, she said, voice trembling. We're out. They collapsed in the grass just beyond the tree line. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the low rumble of the hollow dying behind them, its secrets finally choking on their own weight. Betty Jo held the dog tags against her chest, their cold metal pressing into her skin. She felt the heartbeat beneath it. Hers, Tucker's, and maybe a little of James's too. She whispered to the wind, "It's done." But somewhere deep below, she could still hear the faint hum of the generators. The hollow wasn't dead yet, just waiting. And she wasn't finished either. The ridge was burning. From miles away, you could see the line of fire crawling along the mountain spine, orange veins under a bruised dawn sky. Helicopters beat the air overhead, the sound like the slow, angry heartbeat of the earth itself. Their rotors stirred the smoke into spirals that reached all the way to heaven. Betty Jo and Tucker climbed the last hill together, hand in hand, covered in dust and ash. The hollow behind them groaned as its vents collapsed for good, sending gray clouds into the sky. The wind carried the scent of burned pine and iron. The entire mountain seemed to exhale. "Keep moving, baby," Betty Jo said, voice hoarse. "We're almost there." Ahead, the lights of Blackthorn shimmered through the haze, blue and red strobes, searchlights, flashbulbs. The truth was no longer buried. It was crawling up out of the dirt, alive and angry. Down in the valley, Reverend Silas stood in the churchyard, his old hands trembling as he stacked boxes onto a folding table. Inside were the copies of everything they had fought for: the tapes, the microfilm, the ledger scans, the gold slivers. Every piece labeled and logged, the evidence ready for whoever had the guts to claim it. When the FBI finally arrived, 2 black SUVs and a helicopter that blew gravel across the grass, Silas met them with a calm that came from something deeper than faith. The lead agent, a woman with a tired face and wine-tangled hair, stepped forward. "You Reverend Silas McGraw?" He nodded. "Been a long week." "We understand you've been sheltering a fugitive," she said, eyes narrowing. Silas didn't flinch. "If telling the truth's a crime, then yes, ma'am, I have." He handed her a manila envelope. Inside were chain of custody notes he'd written in his neat preacher's hand, documenting every transfer of evidence from the bunker to the church. At the bottom, his own signature. "This one's my confession," he said, "for helping her, for believing her, for still thinking God picks the broken ones to do his hardest work." The agent studied him for a long moment, then took the envelope and nodded. "We'll take it from here." But Silas knew better. No one ever really took it from here. The truth had its own legs now. Inside the McCandless estate, Maeve coughed blood into a lace handkerchief. The walls trembled with each explosion from the ridge. Her once grand ballroom now flickered with light from half a dozen screens showing live feeds, the same cameras she'd used to monitor the vault. But the feed wasn't private anymore. It was streaming across the country. Reporters' voices echoed from the TVs, talking over one another. Sources confirm the footage is authentic. A network of shell companies linked directly to McCandless Mining. Former Senator Boyd's name appears on the documents released. Maeve's hand shook as she reached for her oxygen mask. The nurse tried to steady her, but she waved the woman away. "Leave it," she rasped. She turned her eyes toward the nearest camera and pressed the button on the intercom one last time. Her voice, cracked and low, carried through the broadcast. "They all knew," she whispered. "Boyd, Kane, the church, the bureau, every last one of them." She coughed hard, blood speckling the silk scarf around her neck. "They built this town on stolen bones and gold that wasn't theirs. You wanted names? Write them down before they bury me, too." Her hand fell away. The mask slipped to the floor, and the screen went dark. On the road below the ridge, Betty Jo and Tucker stumbled out of the trees, clothes torn, faces gray with ash. A convoy of sheriff's vehicles sped toward them, headlights cutting through the smoke. Deputy Hollister was behind the wheel of the lead cruiser, his face pale and furious. He slammed on the brakes, gravel flying. The door flew open. He stepped out with his pistol drawn. "It ends here, Harlan!" Betty Jo pulled Tucker behind her. "You don't have to do this, Hollister." His eyes were glassy, his voice ragged. "You think they'll let me live after all this? I'm cleaning up the mess." From behind the dust came another sound, the rumble of minivan engines. Headlights flared from both sides of the road as a line of vehicles pulled in. Battered Hondas, old Fords, even a school bus. Teachers, parents, churchgoers, all of them. Miss Loretta stepped out of the lead van, her gray hair tied up, her hands steady on the steering wheel before she killed the engine. "You so much as raise that gun," she called, "and you'll have to explain to the whole world why you shot a preacher's kid and a schoolteacher's favorite student on live television." Hollister froze. Dozens of phones were aimed at him, their lights cutting through the smoke like stars. Uh, Loretta walked closer, unafraid. "Put it down, boy." For a long second, no one breathed. Then Hollister's shoulders sagged. The pistol dropped to the pavement with a dull clatter. He backed away, his eyes empty. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They owned everything." "Not anymore," Loretta said softly. Betty Jo fell to her knees beside Tucker, her arms wrapping tight around him. The wind whipped her hair into her face. Sirens wailed in the distance, blending with the thump of Black Hawks overhead. The world was chaos, flashing lights, shouts, the smell of burning pine. But for the first time in forever, she felt peace. They started down the last stretch toward town. When they reached the church, the crowd waiting there parted silently. Reporters lifted cameras. Phones rose like candles. The red glow of recording lights shimmered on their faces. Betty Jo and Tucker climbed the church steps, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Silas met them at the door. His voice cracked when he said, "Welcome home." Betty Jo smiled through the tears. "We made it, preacher. You sure did." Behind them, the ridge still burned, but the firelight had turned gold. The helicopters circled overhead, their rotors scattering ash like snow. As Betty Jo sank onto the steps, Tucker rested his head against her shoulder. Around them, the people of Blackthorn pressed closer, not out of pity, but reverence. Someone began to clap, then another, then the whole crowd. It wasn't joy, it was release. Dozens of camera flashes went off at once, freezing the image in time. A mother and son covered in dust and light, unbroken, framed by the church cross glowing in the smoke behind them. 100 shaking hands caught the moment from every angle. Within hours, it would travel farther than any of them could imagine. And as Betty Jo closed her eyes, she whispered the words she had carried for years, meant for a husband she would never see again. "It's over, James," we told them. For the first time, the mountain was silent. 1 year later, autumn returned to Blackthorn Ridge the way forgiveness does, slow, quiet, and unexpected. The mountains were gold again, their slopes dusted with the kind of light that made everything look gentler than it had any right to be. The fires were long gone, but the smell of smoke still lingered in memory, woven into the wood and the soil. The hollow no longer slept beneath secrecy. The vault had been stripped, scrubbed, and reborn. Its new sign, carved by local hands, read Devil's Hollow Truth Center. Every Saturday, the doors opened to busloads of schoolchildren and tourists who came to see what the government once called Project Phoenix, and what the locals now called Reckoning. The air inside the vault was cool and clean, the old hum of generators replaced by the steady whisper of filtered vents. The exhibits told the story plainly. No embellishments, no blame too soft to be true. One wall displayed the ledgers and photographs. Another showed the timeline of lies painted in red, black, and gold. But the best part wasn't the glass cases or the plaques. It was the children. Third graders in matching yellow shirts acted as junior docents, leading groups through the halls with flashlights and practiced pride. "This switch here used to seal the whole mountain," one little girl explained, tapping the control panel. "But Miss Betty Jo made it safe. She flipped it back." Visitors laughed gently, not knowing that she was right. The town had changed in more ways than one. The distilleries seized from the McCandless and Vaughn families were converted into scholarship funds for miners' children. Silas helped oversee the program, though he refused to have his name on any plaque. "I'm still paying my dues," he'd say. On the courthouse lawn stood a new bronze bell, cast from melted badges and bullets collected after the investigation, one of them Hollister's. When the town gathered for meetings, the bell tolled once, low and heavy, to remind everyone that truth had a sound. Maeve McCandless did not live to see any of it. She died quietly in federal custody 6 months after her empire fell. Her final letter, written in shaky ink on a piece of state-issued stationery, arrived addressed not to lawyers or senators, but to Tucker Harlan. He'd read it only once under the church oak with his mother watching. "Dear boy, the hollow always needed a keeper. Your father thought it was built to hide. Your mother proved it was built to reveal. Don't repeat either of us. Build something that outlives a secret. Maeve McCandless. Tucker folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He was taller now, leaner, with his father's quiet eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. Betty Jo turned down every offer of restitution and book deals. When a Nashville reporter asked her why, she said, "I don't need their money. I just want an honest sunrise." She bought a piece of land on the edge of town, 2 acres, 1 pine tree, and a creek that sang at night. She built a tiny A-frame cabin with her own hands, painted it blue, and filled the shed with carburetors and engines to tinker on. Tucker worked part-time at the museum, giving tours, fixing the lights, and keeping the story alive. Every once in a while, Betty Jo would drive past the ridge and park near the entrance of the Truth Center. She never went inside. She'd just sit in the truck, window down, listening to the wind whistle through the vents, what used to sound like breath, now sounding like peace. On the first anniversary of the fire, the town gathered at the cemetery. The air was crisp, the sky a clean Appalachian blue. Families brought lanterns, candles, and folded notes. The bell tolled once. Betty Jo and Tucker stood before James Harlan's headstone. The engraving had been replaced, the new one reading simply, "James Harlan, truth has no rank." Tucker reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a wrench, gold-plated, polished to a mirror shine. He set it gently against the stone. "What's that for?" Betty Jo asked softly. He smiled. "Some doors aren't meant to stay shut." She felt her throat tighten. "You sound like your daddy?" "Maybe," he said, "but I think I sound like you." The crowd behind them began to sing, an old hymn, the same one Silas had broadcast the night of the explosion. The melody drifted across the graves and up into the trees. As the sun began to dip, the museum's vents caught the wind. It whispered through them, carrying a sound that was neither mechanical nor ghostly, just human. People who came later swore they could still hear it if they stood close enough, a hollow exhale, soft as prayer, turning from warning to witness. And somewhere between the ridge and the river, the mountain finally stopped keeping secrets.